The grocery envelope that had held our weekly food money for 43 years was empty. I watched my son's wife, Linda, come downstairs with expensive shopping bags, while my grandson had no milk for breakfast. That empty envelope was just the beginning. Soon she'd change our door codes, lock me out of my own house, and call me excess baggage on the porch I'd built myself. But Linda underestimated one thing: a desperate old man's determination to reclaim what's rightfully his. When I returned days later, I brought someone she never expected, and her face turned pale. That's when everything changed. Stay with me to see exactly how a 75-year-old grandfather turned the tables on the woman who thought she could steal his life. I stirred the pot of oatmeal slowly, watching the thick bubbles rise and pop against the metal sides. The gas flame underneath burned blue and steady, same as it had every morning since I'd installed this stove 15 years ago. Steam rose from the surface, carrying the familiar scent of rolled oats and a pinch of cinnamon. But something felt hollow about the ritual today. My fingers kept returning to that empty envelope, now folded neatly beside the coffee maker, as if touching it might somehow make those missing bills reappear. The wooden spoon felt heavier than usual in my arthritis-stiffened grip, and I found myself stirring counterclockwise instead of my usual clockwise pattern. A small disruption that seemed to echo the morning's strange beginning. Each scrape of wood against metal sounded louder than necessary in the morning quiet. The sound of silk against the wooden stairs made me look up from the stove. Linda descended slowly, one manicured hand trailing along the banister, the other clutching an iced latte that dripped condensation onto her rose-colored robe. The drink was from that expensive coffee place downtown, the same place that charged $6 for what I could make at home for 50 cents. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled despite the early hour, and diamond earrings caught the morning light streaming through the kitchen window. She moved with the calculated grace of someone always aware of being watched, even in her own home. The heels of her slippers clicked against the tile floor as she approached the breakfast table, where I'd already set out placemats and napkins for 3 people. Her phone was already in her hand, thumb scrolling through what appeared to be online shopping sites. She dropped a cream-colored Sephora bag onto the table with a soft thud, the tissue paper inside rustling like autumn leaves. I could see the receipt poking out from the top. Another triple-digit purchase, judging by the length of the printed numbers. The bag landed directly on top of the morning newspaper I'd folded neatly beside my grandson's usual place setting, covering the headlines about rising grocery prices and local budget concerns. Her movements had an almost theatrical quality, each gesture designed to claim space and attention in the quiet kitchen. The contrast struck me immediately. My careful morning preparations versus her casual disruption of the established order. "Where's the boy's milk?" I asked, nodding toward the refrigerator while continuing to stir the oatmeal. My voice came out steady and calm, the way it always did when I was working to keep emotion in check. I'd learned long ago that direct questions often revealed more than accusations or complaints ever could. The empty grocery envelope seemed to pulse beside the coffee maker, and I wondered if she'd noticed it sitting there, folded and obviously depleted. My grandson would be down soon, school bag in hand, expecting his usual glass of whole milk with 2 ice cubes, the same breakfast routine we'd maintained since he'd started living with us 6 months ago. The silence that followed my question stretched longer than it should have. Linda's laugh was sharp and dismissive, cutting through the gentle bubbling of the oatmeal like a blade through silk. "Drink water. He'll be fine," she said, not bothering to look up from her phone screen. The words fell flat against the kitchen tiles, carrying no warmth or consideration for an 8-year-old boy who'd already faced enough disruptions in his young life. Her thumb continued scrolling rapidly through what looked like designer handbag websites, the screen casting blue light across her face. I noticed she didn't ask about the empty envelope, didn't inquire about groceries or meals for the day ahead. The casual cruelty of her response hit me like a cold wind, but I kept my expression neutral. "He's 8 years old," I said quietly, setting down the wooden spoon with deliberate care. "Growing boys need proper nutrition." "Oh, please," she scoffed, finally looking up from her screen with eyes that held no warmth. "1 morning without milk won't kill him. You baby him too much anyway." Her manicured finger tapped against the phone case with irritation, as if my concern for basic nutrition was somehow an inconvenience to her morning routine. Maybe if you didn't spoil him so much, he wouldn't expect everything handed to him. The irony of her words wasn't lost on me, coming from someone who'd just dropped another expensive cosmetics purchase on the breakfast table. I stayed silent, letting her words hang in the air while I ladled the steaming oatmeal into 3 bowls. The ceramic made soft scraping sounds against the metal spoon, and I found myself moving with extra care, as if precision in these small tasks could somehow restore order to the morning's strange disruptions. I carried the largest bowl to my grandson's place at the table, steam rising from the surface like morning mist over a quiet lake. The routine felt both familiar and foreign now, colored by that empty envelope and Linda's casual disregard for the boy's needs. "That grocery money," I began carefully, my eyes finding hers across the kitchen. "It was meant for the week's food." Linda's expression hardened, her perfectly contoured features settling into lines of defensive hostility. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice taking on a practiced innocence that didn't match the guilt flickering in her eyes. "Maybe you forgot to put it there. You are getting older, after all." The words carried a calculated sting, designed to make me question my own memory and competence. Her phone buzzed with what sounded like a shopping notification, and she glanced down at it with obvious relief at the distraction. Hours later, as the kitchen clock struck nearly 10 p.m., the front door slammed shut with enough force to rattle the picture frames in the hallway, followed by the familiar sound of Ethan dropping his briefcase beside the coat closet. The morning's tension had lingered throughout the day like a bitter aftertaste, and I'd spent the afternoon wondering how to explain to my grandson why there was no milk for his after-school snack. I looked up from the evening news, noting the digital clock on the cable box read 9:47 p.m., later than usual, even for his demanding schedule at the insurance office downtown. His footsteps moved heavily across the hardwood floor, each step carrying the weight of another long day spent managing other people's disasters and disappointments. Through the archway, I could see his tie hanging crooked and loose around his neck, his white dress shirt wrinkled and stained with what looked like coffee near the left pocket. The man who'd once been my energetic little boy, the one who'd helped me plant roses in the backyard every spring, now moved through his own home like a stranger, navigating unfamiliar territory. Linda appeared from the living room, where she'd been watching reality television for the past 3 hours, the sound of manufactured drama still echoing from the oversized speakers. She carried a flat, cardboard box that reeked of grease and processed cheese, the kind of cheap pizza that left an oily film in your mouth hours after eating. The box hit the dining table with a hollow slap, disturbing the stack of mail I'd sorted earlier, and knocking over the small ceramic salt shaker my wife had bought during our honeymoon in Santa Fe 38 years ago. "Dinner's served," she announced with mock cheerfulness, her voice carrying the same dismissive tone she'd used that morning when discussing my grandson's milk. The pizza inside looked like it had been sitting under heat lamps for hours. The cheese congealed into rubbery patches, and the crust dried to the texture of cardboard. I caught sight of another shopping bag beside her chair. this one from that expensive boutique in Scottsdale. I stared at the greasy cardboard box, feeling something cold settle in my chest, like a stone dropped into still water. "I can't eat this," I said quietly, the words coming out more tired than angry. At 75, my digestive system had grown particular about late meals and processed foods, but that wasn't really the point. This wasn't about nutrition or personal preference. It was about what we'd become as a family, how we'd drifted from home-cooked meals around a properly set table to grabbing whatever was convenient and cheap. I remembered the Sunday dinners my wife used to prepare, the smell of roast chicken filling the house, while we all gathered to share stories from our week. Those memories felt like artifacts from another lifetime, distant and precious as photographs in an old album. Linda's response came swift and cutting, delivered with the precision of someone who'd been rehearsing put-downs all day. "Then fix your own. I'm not running a diner," she said, already turning away from the table as if the conversation was beneath her attention. Her words hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle, acrid and lingering. She moved toward the living room with the fluid confidence of someone who'd never doubted their right to occupy space, to make demands, to dismiss other people's needs without consequence. I watched her go, noting how she stepped around my grandson's backpack without acknowledging it, how she avoided making eye contact with either of us. "Linda," Ethan said tiredly, loosening his tie completely. "Dad's just asking for something he can actually eat." She whirled around, her silk blouse catching the overhead light as she faced us both with sudden fury. "Your father acts like I'm his personal chef. I work too, you know." The lie came so smoothly I almost admired its audacity. Her work consisted of managing social media accounts for a friend's boutique, something that required perhaps 2 hours of actual effort per week. "I can't be expected to cater to every little preference and dietary restriction in this house." "It's not about preference," I said gently, my voice carrying decades of patience worn thin. "It's about basic consideration for family." Her laugh was brittle and sharp, like ice cracking under pressure. "Family? You mean the family that criticizes everything I do? The family that makes me feel like a stranger in my own home?" Her voice rose with practiced victimhood, the kind of performance I'd seen too many times before when she was backed into a corner. "Maybe if I felt more supported, I'd be more motivated to cook elaborate meals." My grandson, who'd been sitting quietly at the table with his homework spread across the placemat, looked up from his math worksheets with eyes too knowing for his 8 years. The tension between the adults seemed to press down on his small shoulders like a physical weight. Without a word, he reached across the table and carefully peeled away the softest piece of cheese from the pizza, the part that hadn't completely solidified into an inedible mass. "Grandpa, this part is soft," he said simply, sliding the warm cheese onto my plate with the gentle consideration that seemed to come naturally to him. His small gesture carried more kindness than I'd felt in this house for months, a reminder that decency and care could survive even in an atmosphere of neglect and indifference. I tightened my grip on the moss-green ceramic mug, the one I'd been drinking coffee from for over 2 decades, until my knuckles showed white against the weathered skin. The mug had been a Father's Day gift from Ethan when he was still in college, still full of plans and dreams and respect for the man who'd raised him. Now it felt like an anchor in stormy waters, something solid and familiar to hold on to while everything else seemed to shift and change around me. The ceramic was warm from the coffee I'd poured an hour earlier, and the small chip near the handle reminded me of all the mornings this mug had seen, all the conversations it had witnessed, all the quiet moments of a life lived in this kitchen. I didn't answer my grandson's kindness with words, couldn't trust my voice not to crack, but I nodded my thanks and took the offered cheese, tasting salt that had nothing to do with seasoning. Around us, the kitchen felt smaller somehow, as if the walls themselves were closing in on what remained of our fractured family. 3 days later, I stood on my own front porch like a stranger. My arthritic fingers fumbled with the familiar number sequence on the electronic lock, 0715, the date Ethan graduated high school. The small screen flashed red and emitted a sharp beep that cut through the afternoon silence. I tried again, pressing each digit slowly and deliberately, the same code I'd been using for the past 2 years since we'd installed this system for convenience. Red beep again. My chest tightened as I realized what this meant, but I forced myself to stay calm and reached for my house key instead. The metal felt cold against my palm as I slid it toward the deadbolt, only to find it wouldn't turn. The lock mechanism had been changed completely. I stood there on the concrete steps, holding my useless key like a relic from another life. The routine cardiac checkup at St. Joseph's had taken longer than expected, 3 hours of waiting rooms and tests that confirmed what I already knew. My heart was fine, just old and tired like the rest of me. But now, staring at the red numbers on this digital display, I felt something different stirring in my chest. I pulled out my phone and dialed Linda's number, listening to it ring 6 times before going to voicemail. Her recorded voice was bright and cheerful, asking callers to leave a message for her busy schedule. I hung up without speaking. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman with no job was apparently too busy to answer calls from the man who owned the house she lived in. My second call went to Ethan's office line. The receptionist put me through immediately, and I heard the familiar sound of keyboard clicking in the background as he worked. "Dad? How did the appointment go?" His voice carried genuine concern, the same tone he'd used as a boy when asking if I was okay after a hard day at work. For a moment, I felt hopeful that this was all some misunderstanding, some simple explanation that would make sense of my current predicament. "The appointment was fine," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the frustration building behind my ribs. "But I can't get into the house. The door code doesn't work anymore." The pause that followed lasted too long. I could hear Ethan's breathing change, becoming more careful and measured. "Linda changed it. For safety. Don't worry, Dad. I'll be home in 20 minutes. The way he said safety made it sound like a rehearsed explanation, something he'd been preparing to say. There was guilt in his voice, the same tone he'd used as a teenager when caught in a lie about missed curfews or undone homework. "Safety from what?" I asked, but he'd already hung up. I stood there holding the silent phone, feeling the desert heat press down on my shoulders through my cotton shirt. A neighbor's dog barked in the distance, and I wondered if Mrs. Peterson next door had noticed me standing here, locked out of my own home like some kind of vagrant. The thought made my face burn with embarrassment that had nothing to do with the Arizona sun. 23 minutes later, Ethan's sedan pulled into the driveway with the hurried urgency of someone dealing with an unpleasant but necessary task. He climbed out wearing his work clothes, pressed khakis and a polo shirt with his company logo, but his shoulders were hunched forward like he was walking into a strong wind. His keys jingled as he approached, and I noticed he avoided making direct eye contact with me. Instead, he focused on the electronic keypad with the intense concentration of someone performing surgery. "New code is 2489, he said, his fingers moving quickly across the numbers. The lock chirped cheerfully and clicked open, the sound somehow both welcoming and accusatory. He held the door for me like I was a guest being shown into someone else's home. "I should have called you earlier. Sorry about that." I stepped across the threshold into my own foyer, breathing in the familiar scent of the lemon polish I used on the hardwood floors every Sunday. But something felt different now, as if the very air inside had changed composition while I was away. Linda stood in the hallway, about 10 feet back from the door, her arms crossed over her chest, and her weight shifted onto one hip in a posture of defensive judgment. She wore a sundress that probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month, and her expression held all the warmth of a tax audit. The way she looked at me, not angry, not guilty, just coldly assessing, made me feel like an intruder who'd somehow gained unauthorized access to her personal space. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire ready to snap. I could hear the central air conditioning humming through the vents overhead, and the distant sound of my grandson's video game coming from upstairs. Normal household sounds that should have felt comforting, but instead seemed to emphasize how abnormal this moment had become. Linda's eyes moved from me to Ethan and back again, as if she was calculating something important. Her manicured fingernails tapped against her upper arm in a rhythm that suggested impatience rather than nervousness. "Why wasn't I told?" I asked, directing the question to both of them, but keeping my voice level and reasonable. I'd learned long ago that accusations and anger rarely produced honest answers, but direct questions sometimes caught people off guard enough to reveal truth. The hall light cast shadows across Linda's face, highlighting the sharp angles of her cheekbones and the careful application of her makeup. She looked like she was posing for a magazine photograph, even in this tense moment. Linda's response came without hesitation, delivered in the same tone she might use to explain why she'd rearranged furniture without consultation. "We can't always adapt to you," she said, each word precise and cutting. The plural pronoun felt like a knife twist. "We," as if she and Ethan were a unified front against some external threat that happened to be me. Her chin lifted slightly as she spoke, a gesture I'd seen her use when she felt challenged or criticized. It was the physical manifestation of someone who believed they held all the power in a situation. Ethan shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his keys still jingling softly in his hand. "It's temporary," he said quickly, as if speed might somehow soften the impact of what was happening. His eyes darted between Linda and me like a tennis spectator watching a particularly brutal match. "Just until we figure out, until things settle down a bit." The vagueness of his explanation felt deliberate, designed to avoid specifics that might incriminate or commit him to any particular course of action. "Settle down from what?" I asked, but Linda was already turning away, her heels clicking against the hardwood as she moved toward the kitchen. The conversation was apparently over in her mind, dismissed with the casual authority of someone who'd never had their basic security questioned. Ethan followed her with his eyes, and I saw something I'd never noticed before. The way he waited for her subtle signals, the way he seemed to need her approval even for the smallest decisions. "We'll talk later, Dad," Ethan said, patting my shoulder with the kind of hollow reassurance people offer when they have no intention of explaining anything. "I need to get changed." He headed for the stairs, leaving me standing alone in the foyer of my own home, holding a new door code that felt like a leash around my neck. The sound of Linda's heels had faded into the kitchen, but I could still feel her presence like a cold draft seeping under a badly fitted door. I looked around at the family photos on the hallway table. Pictures of Ethan's childhood, his wedding, my grandson's school portraits, and realized that none of them included me anymore. When exactly had I become the outsider in my own family story? The question would haunt me for days to come, but something told me the answer was more complicated than I was ready to understand. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of dry heat that made the air shimmer like water above the pavement. I sat in my leather recliner, watching my grandson build an elaborate castle from his Legos on the coffee table, each plastic brick carefully placed with the focused determination that only 8-year-olds possessed. The living room felt peaceful for the first time in weeks, filled with the soft, clicking sounds of construction and the distant hum of the air conditioner working overtime against the desert heat. Linda had been upstairs for nearly 2 hours, and I could hear her moving around in the master bedroom, drawers opening and closing with the urgency of someone preparing for something important. The sound of running water from the ensuite bathroom suggested she was taking her time getting ready, whatever that meant. My grandson looked up from his creation, a complex structure involving knights, dragons, and what appeared to be a medieval McDonald's. "Grandpa, do you think dragons like hamburgers?" he asked, with the kind of serious curiosity that made conversations with children so refreshing. Before I could answer, Linda's heels began their familiar clicking down the wooden stairs. She appeared in the doorway, wearing a black dress that hugged her figure and silver jewelry that caught the lamplight like small stars. Her makeup was heavier than usual, the kind of dramatic look she typically reserved for special occasions or important meetings. "I'm going out," she announced to the room in general, not making eye contact with either of us. Her purse was already slung over her shoulder, and she held her car keys with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd made this speech before. "There's leftover Chinese food in the fridge if anyone gets hungry." The way she said it suggested that our nutritional needs were entirely our own responsibility, not something that concerned her evening plans. "Where to?" I asked, keeping my tone conversational rather than interrogatory. I'd learned that direct challenges only made Linda more defensive and secretive, while casual interest sometimes yielded actual information. She paused in the doorway, her hand already reaching for the light switch that would signal her departure from this domestic scene. "Dance club downtown," she said without turning around. "Some of the girls from yoga wanted to check out that new place on Mill Avenue." The explanation came too quickly and with too much unnecessary detail, the way lies often did when people felt compelled to over-explain their fiction. I noticed she didn't mention which yoga class, which friends, or which specific club, despite the wealth of detail about their supposed planning process. My grandson looked up from his Legos again, his small face scrunched in concentration. "Mommy Linda, will you be back before my bedtime?" The innocent question carried an undertone of hope that made my chest tighten. Despite everything, the boy still wanted the adults in his life to care about his routines, his need for security and predictability. "Probably not, sweetie," she said, her voice softening slightly when addressing him directly. "Grandpa will tuck you in tonight." With that, she disappeared through the front door, leaving behind the faint scent of expensive perfume and the sound of her car engine starting in the driveway. Through the window, I watched her headlights sweep across the neighbor's fence as she backed out and drove away into the gathering darkness. The house settled into quiet again, broken only by the gentle sounds of Lego construction and the evening news murmuring from the television. My grandson worked in silence for several minutes, his small fingers sorting through colored bricks with methodical precision. Then, without looking up from his castle, he tugged gently at my sleeve. The gesture was so subtle I almost missed it, but something in his body language told me he had something important to say. "Grandpa," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the clicking plastic. "Yesterday when you were at the doctor, Mommy Linda said she was going to the grocery store." He paused, glancing toward the front door as if making sure she was really gone. "But I saw her at that cafe by my school. She was sitting with a young man. They were laughing and holding hands across the table." The words hit me like a physical blow, but I forced my expression to remain calm for his sake. Children were remarkably perceptive about adult emotions, and the last thing I wanted was to burden him with the weight of what his innocent observation might mean. I nodded slowly, my mind racing through the implications while my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Did you recognize the man?" I asked quietly, trying to keep my voice as casual as his had been. My grandson shook his head, still focused on his castle construction, as if this conversation was nothing more than idle commentary about the weather. He looked younger than Daddy. He had dark hair and wore a red shirt. The matter-of-fact way he delivered this information suggested he didn't fully understand its significance, which was probably a blessing. They looked happy. Mommy Linda was smiling more than she does here. This last observation cut deeper than any accusation could have, carrying the simple honesty that only children possessed. I reached over and ruffled his hair gently, the gesture both affectionate and protective. "Thank you for telling me," I said simply. "Sometimes grown-ups need to know things, even when they're not easy to hear." He nodded solemnly, as if this explanation made perfect sense to his young mind, then returned his attention to placing a tiny Lego flag on the highest tower of his castle. But I could see the worry in his shoulders, the slight tension that suggested he knew this information was somehow important, even if he couldn't articulate why. Monday morning brought with it the routine task of retrieving the weekend's accumulated mail from our roadside box. The metal door squeaked on its hinges as I opened it, revealing the usual collection of catalogs, advertisements, and official-looking envelopes that seemed to multiply regardless of how many subscription services I canceled. My arthritic fingers sorted through the stack as I walked back toward the house, automatically separating the obvious junk mail from items that required attention. Most of it would go directly into the recycling bin, but one envelope made me pause on the front walkway. The Arizona Public Service logo stared back at me from a white envelope marked with red letters spelling "Past Due" in bold, unforgiving print. My name was clearly printed in the address window. John M. Thompson, followed by our home address in precise, computer-generated letters. I tore open the envelope carefully, my mind already racing through possible explanations for why our electricity bill had gone unpaid. Inside, the notice indicated that our account was 67 days overdue, with a balance of $347.83 and a threat of service disconnection within 10 business days, unless payment was received immediately. I stood there staring at the paper, feeling the morning sun warm my shoulders while my blood ran cold with realization. For the past 15 years, since my wife's death, I'd been meticulous about paying our household bills. Every month, I wrote checks and mailed them on the same day, recording each payment in my leather-bound ledger with the precision of an accountant. But 3 months ago, Linda had suggested switching to electronic payments for convenience, claiming it would save me the trouble of writing checks and managing due dates. She'd offered to handle the transition, to set up automatic withdrawals that would ensure bills were always paid on time. "Let me take care of this, Dad," she'd said, with what I'd interpreted as genuine concern for making my life easier. "Electronic payments are so much more reliable than the mail." I'd been grateful for her offer, appreciating what seemed like a rare gesture of consideration for my aging convenience. Now, holding this past due notice in my trembling hands, I realized I'd been a fool to trust her with something so fundamental to our household security. I folded the bill carefully and slipped it into my shirt pocket, then continued toward the house with steps that felt heavier than they had when I'd walked to the mailbox. Inside, the familiar coolness of the air conditioning felt like a luxury that might soon be taken away if this bill remained unpaid. I made my way to the living room, intending to call APS immediately and resolve this situation before it escalated further. But something else caught my attention as I crossed the room toward the phone. My wedding photograph with Margaret had been moved. For 38 years, that silver-framed image had held a place of honor on the mantelpiece above our fireplace, positioned where the morning light would catch Margaret's smile and remind me of better times. But now, it sat pushed back against the brick wall, partially hidden behind a small potted plant that hadn't been there before. In its prominent former position, Ethan and Linda's wedding portrait now commanded the central spot, their faces beaming out at the room with the confidence of people who believed their happiness was permanent and unshakable. I approached the mantelpiece slowly, my anger building with each step. The deliberate nature of this rearrangement felt like a violation more profound than the unpaid bills or changed door codes. This was an erasure of history, an attempt to rewrite the story of who belonged in this house and whose memories deserved recognition. I could see a thin layer of dust on Margaret's frame where it had been moved, suggesting this change hadn't happened recently, but had been in place for some time without my noticing. Carefully, I lifted Margaret's photograph and wiped the dust away with the sleeve of my shirt. Her face smiled back at me from behind the glass, captured in a moment of pure joy from our honeymoon in Sedona 43 years ago. She'd been wearing a yellow sundress that day, and the red rocks behind her had provided a backdrop that made her look like something from a magazine cover. I remembered taking this picture, remembered how she'd laughed when I'd asked her to pose just once more because the light was perfect. The memory felt both precious and painful, a reminder of what I'd lost and what was now being systematically erased from my own home. I set Margaret's picture back in its rightful place at the center of the mantelpiece, then moved Ethan and Linda's wedding portrait to a less prominent position beside it. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. 2 marriages, 2 generations, both deserving respect and recognition in the home we'd all shared. But as I stepped back to survey my work, I couldn't shake the feeling that this small act of restoration was really a declaration of war. Linda wouldn't appreciate having her territorial claim challenged, and I suspected she'd have something to say about finding her photograph moved when she returned from whatever dance club had occupied her Saturday evening. The past due notice crinkled in my shirt pocket as I reached for the phone to call APS, a reminder that the problems in this house went far deeper than picture placement and hurt feelings. If Linda was stealing from the household budget for her own purposes, if she was meeting strange men while claiming to go grocery shopping, if she was systematically erasing my presence from my own home, then perhaps it was time I started paying closer attention to exactly what kind of woman my son had married. What other secrets was Linda hiding, and how far would she go to keep them buried? Stay tuned to find out how deep this betrayal really runs. I stood at my own front door, fingers hovering over the electronic keypad, with growing frustration. The code Ethan had given me 3 days ago, 2489, flashed red with an angry beep that cut through the evening silence. I tried it again, pressing each number slowly and deliberately, but the screen responded with the same dismissive rejection. My watch showed 8:47 p.m., and neither Ethan nor Linda had returned from whatever errands had taken them away for the past 4 hours. The APS bill crinkled in my shirt pocket as I reached for my house key, a constant reminder of the conversation we needed to have about missing household funds and unpaid utilities. But when I tried the key, it turned uselessly in the lock. They'd changed it again without telling me. The growl of an engine interrupted my brooding, and I looked up to see Ethan's silver SUV turning into our driveway, with headlights cutting through the gathering darkness. The vehicle moved slowly, almost hesitantly, as if the driver was reluctant to arrive at their destination. Through the windshield, I could see 2 silhouettes in the front seats, their body language suggesting an ongoing conversation or argument. The engine died with a mechanical sigh, and both doors opened simultaneously with the synchronized precision of people who'd rehearsed this moment. Linda emerged first from the passenger side, unfolding herself from the seat with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to making entrances. She wore a tight red dress that looked expensive and impractical. The kind of outfit that suggested fine dining rather than running errands around suburban Phoenix. Her heels clicked against the concrete driveway as she moved toward the front steps, and I caught the sharp, sweet scent of her perfume mixed with something else. Wine, maybe, or the lingering atmosphere of whatever upscale establishment had occupied their afternoon. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled despite the evening heat, and her makeup looked freshly applied rather than worn from a day of mundane activities. Ethan followed more slowly, his movements carrying the heavy reluctance of a man walking toward an unpleasant duty. He wore dress slacks and a button-down shirt that suggested their errands had involved someplace that required better attire than grocery stores or gas stations. His eyes found mine briefly as he approached the porch, then darted away with the guilty reflex of someone who knew they'd been caught in a deception. The distance between him and Linda seemed carefully maintained, as if they'd agreed on their respective roles in whatever scene was about to unfold on my front porch. I stood up from the swing, feeling my joints protest after hours of sitting and thinking. The wooden boards beneath my feet creaked with familiar sounds that had marked thousands of evenings just like this one, except tonight felt charged with unspoken tensions and approaching confrontation. "Give me the code," I said, keeping my voice calm and reasonable, despite the anger simmering beneath my ribs. "This is still my house." Linda's laugh was sharp and cutting, like glass breaking against concrete. She paused at the bottom of the porch steps, one hand resting on the railing with casual ownership, while her eyes assessed me with cold calculation. "Your house?" she repeated, her voice dripping with mock surprise. "Guests don't get codes, John. You're excess baggage." The words hit me like physical blows, each syllable carefully chosen for maximum impact. She said my name like it tasted bitter in her mouth, without the respect or affection that should exist between family members. The audacity of her statement left me momentarily speechless. Excess baggage. In the house I'd bought with money earned from 47 years of steady work, on the porch I'd built with my own hands, in front of the rose garden I tended every weekend. I turned toward Ethan, hoping to see some flash of recognition in his face, some acknowledgement of how wrong this had become. "Son, you know whose name is on the deed," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the tremor of rage building in my chest. Ethan's response came without meeting my eyes, his head lowered like a child being scolded for something he couldn't deny but refused to fully acknowledge. "Dad, please, don't make this worse." The defeat in his voice was worse than Linda's open hostility. This was my son, the boy I'd taught to ride a bicycle and change a tire, the young man I'd helped through college and his first job interview. Now he stood on my porch, asking me not to make trouble in my own home, as if my presence was the problem, rather than his wife's systematic campaign of disrespect and theft. "Make what worse?" I asked, but Linda was already moving up the steps with predatory confidence. Her heels struck each wooden board like hammer blows, and she reached the electronic keypad with the urgency of someone seizing control of a situation. Her manicured fingers moved quickly across the numbers, too quickly for me to catch the new sequence, and the lock disengaged with its familiar electronic chirp. "Come on, honey," she said to Ethan, her voice suddenly honeyed with false sweetness. She grabbed his elbow with possessive authority and pulled him toward the doorway, her other hand already pushing the door wide enough for them to slip inside together. "We don't need this drama tonight." The word drama fell from her lips like an accusation, as if my desire to enter my own home was some kind of theatrical performance designed to inconvenience her evening plans. Ethan allowed himself to be pulled along, offering no resistance to his wife's physical guidance or moral authority. He glanced back at me once as they crossed the threshold, his face carrying the haunted expression of someone who knew they were making the wrong choice, but felt powerless to change course. "We'll talk tomorrow, Dad," he said, the words weak and hollow as autumn leaves. "I promise." The door slammed shut between us with a sound like thunder, followed immediately by the electronic lock clicking into place with the finality of a judge's gavel. I stood alone on the porch, staring at the painted wood that now separated me from my own living room, my own kitchen, my own bedroom, where I'd slept beside Margaret for 25 years before cancer took her away. The porch light automatically flickered on, triggered by motion sensors I'd installed for safety and convenience, now illuminating my humiliation for any neighbors who might be watching this domestic drama unfold. I remained on the porch for nearly an hour, sitting back down on the swing and trying to process what had just happened. The night air had cooled slightly, carrying the sound of televisions through open windows and the distant hum of air conditioners working against the desert heat. A few cars passed on our quiet street, their headlights briefly illuminating my solitary figure before disappearing into the darkness beyond our neighborhood. I felt like a ghost haunting my own property, visible but powerless, present but unwelcome in the space I'd called home for over 4 decades. The sound of the side door opening made me look up from my brooding contemplation. The door led from our kitchen to the small side yard where I kept the garbage cans and recycling bins, an area invisible from the street but within sight of my position on the front porch. My grandson appeared in the doorway, struggling with a white trash bag that seemed almost as big as he was. His small hands gripped the plastic handles with determination, and he moved carefully down the 3 concrete steps that led to the garbage area. "Grandpa?" His voice carried across the yard with surprise and concern. "Why don't you come inside?" The innocent question hung in the evening air like a challenge to the adult world's complicated cruelties. He set the trash bag down beside the metal can and looked at me with the clear, unguarded expression that only children possessed. There was no judgment in his eyes, no understanding of the political maneuvering that had led to this moment, just genuine puzzlement about why his grandfather was sitting alone on the front porch instead of inside where he belonged. I forced a smile, the expression feeling stiff and unconvincing even to myself. "Not tonight, buddy," I said, my voice carrying more sadness than I'd intended. The words felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that Linda's assessment of me as excess baggage might be more accurate than I wanted to believe. I stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, close enough to reach over and ruffle his hair with the affection that had become one of the few pure pleasures left in my complicated family situation. His hair was soft under my fingers, still carrying the scent of the strawberry shampoo he insisted on using because it smelled like candy. For a moment, the simple physical connection between grandfather and grandson felt like an anchor in the storm of adult betrayals and power struggles. This boy, at least, still saw me as someone worthy of love and respect, someone whose presence was desired rather than merely tolerated. "Are you sleeping outside tonight?" he asked, with the matter-of-fact curiosity that children brought to even the strangest situations. "Should I bring you a pillow?" The offer was so innocent and generous that it made my throat tighten with emotions I couldn't safely express. Here was an 8-year-old boy ready to share his comfort with someone he loved, while the adults in his life played games of exclusion and control that would have baffled and disgusted him if he understood their full implications. "No, sweetie," I managed to say around the lump in my throat. "Grandpa will be fine. You go inside and get ready for bed." He nodded obediently, but I could see the worry in his small features, the way children absorbed adult tensions even when they couldn't articulate what was wrong. He picked up the trash bag again, completed his assigned chore with the careful attention to detail that reminded me of myself at that age, then headed back toward the kitchen door. "Grandpa?" he called back before disappearing inside. "I love you." The words floated across the yard like a benediction, simple and pure and completely at odds with the calculated cruelties I'd experienced from the adults in his life. "I love you too, buddy," I called back, but he'd already vanished through the doorway, leaving me alone with the sound of the side door clicking shut like another small rejection. I walked back to the porch swing and sat down heavily, feeling every one of my 75 years settling into my bones like cold weather. The past due electricity bill crackled in my pocket, and I pulled it out to stare at the red letters spelling out the consequences of Linda's financial deceptions. Tomorrow, I decided, things would change. I couldn't continue to be a passive victim in my own life story, couldn't keep hoping that basic decency would somehow reassert itself in people who'd clearly chosen a different path. But first, I needed to find somewhere to spend the night, because one thing had become crystal clear during Linda's performance on the porch steps. The war for my own home was just beginning. The taxi driver's eyes met mine in the rearview mirror as we pulled away from my house, his weathered face showing the kind of practiced indifference that came from years of picking up people during their worst moments. "Where to?" he asked, his voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't place. I gave him the address of the Desert Inn Motel, a place I'd passed countless times during my weekly trips to the hardware store, but never imagined I'd need personally. The irony wasn't lost on me. At 75 years old, I was homeless in the city where I'd lived and worked for over 4 decades. The motel sat like a forgotten relic beside the interstate, its single-story structure stretching along the frontage road with the tired resignation of something that had seen better decades. Pink stucco walls had faded to the color of old salmon, and half the letters in the neon sign flickered intermittently against the night sky. The taxi's headlights swept across a parking lot filled with pickup trucks, sedans with out-of-state plates, and a few motorcycles that suggested the clientele wasn't primarily tourists visiting the Grand Canyon. "You sure about this place?" the driver asked, his tone suggesting he'd dropped people off here before and witnessed the kind of stories that didn't end well. The parking lot was better lit than I'd expected, but the harsh fluorescent glow only emphasized the cracks in the asphalt and the weeds growing through the concrete barriers that separated the motel from the gas station next door. "It's fine," I told him, handing over exact change plus a modest tip. "Just need a place for the night." The lie came easily because the truth was too complicated to explain to a stranger. How could I tell him that my son's wife had just locked me out of my own house, that I'd spent an hour on my front porch feeling like a vagrant in my own neighborhood? Some humiliations were too fresh and raw to share with someone whose meter was still running. The motel office smelled like cigarette smoke and industrial disinfectant, a combination that made my nose burn and reminded me why I'd quit smoking 30 years ago when Margaret was diagnosed with her first bout of lung problems. The clerk behind the bulletproof glass partition looked like he'd seen everything at least twice, his bored expression never changing as he slid the registration paperwork through the metal slot. "Cash or card?" he asked without looking up from his magazine, which appeared to be some kind of automotive publication featuring trucks I couldn't afford and wouldn't want. "Cash," I said, pulling out my wallet and counting 20s onto the scarred counter. The bills felt substantial in my fingers, money I'd withdrawn earlier that week for groceries that never got bought because Linda had emptied the household account for purposes I was only beginning to understand. "Room 14, the clerk said, dropping a plastic key card through the slot with the enthusiasm of someone dispensing parking tickets. "Ice machine's broken, but the vending machines work most of the time." Room 14 was exactly what I'd expected, and somehow worse. The door stuck when I tried to open it, requiring a shoulder push that reminded me of my age and the arthritis that made simple tasks feel like physical challenges. Inside, the carpet was industrial brown, with stains that suggested stories I didn't want to imagine, and the bedspread was covered with a pattern of faded flowers, interrupted by bleach spots that looked like abstract art. The room smelled like a mixture of old cigarettes, cleaning chemicals, and something musty that might have been mildew from the small bathroom I could see through the partially open door. I set my overnight bag on the single chair beside a small table that wobbled when I touched it, then pulled out the plastic bag containing my daily medications. 7 different prescriptions for blood pressure, cholesterol, and the various other conditions that accumulated like dust on the shelves of an aging body. The pills rattled softly in their amber bottles as I arranged them in the order I'd take them tomorrow morning. A routine that felt absurd in this strange room, but provided some small comfort of familiarity in an otherwise surreal situation. The bed squeaked ominously when I sat down on the edge, the mattress soft in a way that suggested wear rather than comfort. Through the thin walls, I could hear a television playing too loud in the adjacent room, and the sound of a couple arguing about money in voices that carried the tired anger of people who'd had the same fight too many times. Outside my window, the neon vacancy sign cast alternating red and blue light across the parking lot, creating a rhythm that would probably keep me awake even if my churning thoughts didn't. I lay back, carefully, feeling the springs shift and groan beneath my weight. The ceiling above me was textured plaster-painted beige, with water stains that formed patterns like abstract maps of places I'd never visit. One stain looked almost like the outline of Texas, another like a coffee cup spilled across imaginary highways. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine I was anywhere else. My own bedroom with its familiar sounds and comfortable mattress, the guest room at my brother's house in Tucson, even the recliner in my living room that had supported so many afternoon naps over the years. But every time I started to drift toward sleep, the reality of my situation crashed back like a wave against rocks. I was 75 years old, lying on a motel bed that smelled like other people's mistakes, because my own family had decided I was expendable. The hollow feeling in my chest had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with the recognition that the life I'd carefully built over decades could be dismantled so casually by people I'd trusted with everything. The air conditioning unit beneath the window rattled and wheezed like an old man with emphysema, blowing streams of dry, recycled air directly across my face, no matter how I positioned myself on the narrow bed. The temperature control knob had only 2 settings that seemed to work: Arctic blast or tropical sauna, and I'd chosen the lesser of 2 discomforts. The mechanical noise filled the room with a constant drone that should have been white noise, but instead felt like Chinese water torture, each rattle and wheeze marking another moment of sleeplessness in what was shaping up to be the longest night of my life. Around midnight, my phone buzzed with its first notification. The screen lit up the dark room like a small beacon, displaying Linda's name and number with the kind of electronic persistence that modern technology brought to human conflict. I let it ring until voicemail picked up, then watched as the notification appeared. Missed call. 5 minutes later, it buzzed again. Same name, same number, same result. By 12:30 a.m., the pattern had repeated 6 times, each call lasting exactly long enough to suggest urgency without providing any actual information about what Linda might want to discuss at this hour. Ethan's calls came later, arriving with the guilty timing of someone who'd been coached on when to make contact. The first one came at 1:15 a.m., and I could picture him standing in the kitchen I'd been locked out of, Linda probably hovering nearby with instructions about what to say and how to say it. I stared at his name on the screen and felt a mixture of love and disappointment that made my chest ache worse than any physical pain I'd experienced. This was the boy I'd taught to throw a baseball, the young man I'd helped move into his first apartment, the son who'd once called me his hero during a Father's Day speech that made Margaret cry happy tears. The second call from Ethan came 20 minutes later, followed by a text message that glowed against the dark ceiling when I held the phone up to read it. "Dad, please call back. We need to talk. This got out of hand." The words carried the hollow ring of damage control, rather than genuine remorse, the careful phrasing of someone who'd been given talking points rather than speaking from their heart. I could almost hear Linda's voice behind his message, coaching him on the right tone to strike between concern and criticism. I scrolled through the call log, seeing their names repeated like evidence in a case I was building against my own family. Linda's 6 calls clustered together in the midnight hour, followed by Ethan's 2 attempts at damage control in the early morning darkness. The pattern told a story I didn't want to read but couldn't ignore. Linda panicking about something, probably the realization that locking me out might have legal consequences she hadn't considered, followed by Ethan being deployed as the voice of reasonable reconciliation. The bathroom faucet dripped with metronomic precision somewhere behind the thin partition wall, each drop echoing in the porcelain like a tiny accusation. Drip. You trusted them? Drip. You gave them everything. Drip. Look where it got you. I closed my eyes and tried to focus on my breathing, instead of the symphony of mechanical noises that filled this depressing room. But my mind kept returning to the image of Linda's smirk, as she'd called me excess baggage, on my own front porch. At 3:17 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. "This is Linda. Answer your phone. We need to discuss arrangements." The clinical tone of the message, combined with her use of a different number, suggested she was thinking strategically about our conflict, rather than emotionally. She'd probably borrowed someone else's phone to get around my ability to ignore her calls, which meant she was escalating rather than backing down from the confrontation. I typed a response several times, deleting each draft before settling on something that felt appropriately dignified. Any arrangements can be discussed through proper channels. It wasn't particularly clever or cutting, but it established that I wasn't going to be manipulated through midnight phone campaigns or borrowed phone numbers. The message showed as delivered immediately, followed by 3 dots indicating she was typing a response. Then, nothing. The silence that followed felt more ominous than her barrage of calls. The neon sign outside continued its hypnotic cycle of red and blue, casting shifting shadows across the water-stained ceiling, while I lay there contemplating how quickly a life could change directions. 24 hours ago, I'd been a grandfather making breakfast in his own kitchen, worried about nothing more complicated than whether there was enough milk for cereal. Now I was a motel refugee, counting missed calls from people who'd decided my presence in my own home was negotiable. But something had shifted during these long hours of mechanical noise and neon light cycles. The hollow feeling in my chest was hardening into something more solid and purposeful, something that felt less like grief and more like determination. Tomorrow, I decided, it was time to stop reacting to Linda's manipulations and start taking action on my own terms. The rental car smelled like industrial air freshener and other people's decisions, its worn fabric seats molded by countless previous occupants who'd needed temporary transportation for reasons they probably didn't want to explain. I'd picked up the economy sedan from Enterprise that morning, using my credit card and showing my valid license to a cheerful clerk who'd assumed I was a tourist or someone whose regular car was in the shop. If only life were that simple. The steering wheel felt unfamiliar under my arthritic hands as I navigated the evening traffic toward downtown Phoenix, following a route I'd mapped out during my sleepless hours in that miserable motel room. I parked 3 blocks away from the Silver Moon, positioning the rental car under a broken streetlight that provided shadow without complete darkness. The bar's neon sign cast purple and blue light across the sidewalk, creating an atmosphere that suggested sophistication, while probably delivering something considerably less refined. Through the large front windows, I could see people moving inside like actors in a play I wasn't invited to watch, their silhouettes animated by conversation and whatever liquid courage they'd purchased to make their evening more bearable. It took me nearly 20 minutes to spot Linda among the Friday night crowd, but when I finally did, my chest tightened with a mixture of vindication and disgust that felt like swallowing broken glass. She sat at a high-top table near the window, perfectly positioned for anyone outside to observe her performance if they knew where to look. Her blonde hair caught the colored lights from overhead, and she wore a black dress that I didn't recognize from her closet, but probably came from one of those shopping expeditions that had been depleting our household funds. The young man sitting across from her looked like he'd stepped out of a fitness magazine advertisement, all sculpted jawline and carefully styled dark hair that probably required more daily maintenance than I spent on my entire appearance. He wore a fitted red shirt that emphasized the kind of muscular build that came from expensive gym memberships and protein supplements, the sort of investment in vanity that suggested someone with time and money to burn. When he leaned forward to say something that made Linda throw her head back in exaggerated laughter, I could see the practiced charm in his movements, the calculated gestures of someone who'd perfected the art of flattery. They clinked their glasses together with the kind of intimate ceremony that belonged to people celebrating something private and probably forbidden. The liquid in their glasses caught the neon light and shimmered like liquid jewels, expensive liquor that cost more per drink than most people spent on dinner. Linda's hand lingered on his arm after the toast, her manicured fingers tracing patterns on his skin with possessive familiarity that made my stomach turn. This wasn't a casual encounter or innocent friendship. This was a relationship with history and intention. I lifted my phone with hands steadier than I'd expected, framing the scene in the small screen like a private investigator documenting evidence for a divorce case. The camera lens captured everything with digital precision. Linda's face animated by genuine pleasure I hadn't seen in my own home for months, the young man's attentive posture as he hung on her every word, the intimate positioning of their chairs that suggested they'd done this before and planned to do it again. The shutter whispered, "Click," so softly I barely heard it over the sound of traffic and distant music from inside the bar. I didn't tremble with rage or grief like I'd expected. Instead, I felt the cold satisfaction of someone gathering evidence for a case I was finally ready to build. Each photograph was another line in a ledger I'd been keeping unconsciously for months, documenting the small cruelties and larger betrayals that had brought me to this moment of sitting in a rental car, spying on my son's wife as she conducted an affair with money stolen from our household budget. The young man looked expensive. His clothes, his watch, his carefully maintained appearance all suggested someone accustomed to being kept in the style Linda was apparently providing. "So, this is where my grocery money went," I murmured to the empty car, my voice carrying more resignation than anger. The photographs on my phone screen showed a story that explained everything. The missing funds, the changed door codes, the systematic campaign to make me feel unwelcome in my own home. Linda needed me gone, not because I was difficult to live with, but because my presence complicated her ability to fund this expensive distraction. I took several more photos as they ordered another round of drinks, capturing the easy intimacy between them and the casual way Linda opened her purse, my grandson's college fund probably financing this evening's entertainment. The young man raised his glass in what looked like a toast to her, and she responded with the kind of radiant smile I remembered from her early days with Ethan, back when she'd been performing for my son, instead of this muscular stranger who looked young enough to be her younger brother. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent decades building a life and family that could be dismantled so casually by someone who'd married into it less than 5 years ago. Linda had surveyed everything I'd worked for: the house, the financial security, the family relationships, and decided it was all negotiable, all available to fund whatever fantasy she was pursuing with this expensive young man who probably didn't know or care about the collateral damage his presence was causing. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. After returning the rental car and checking out of that miserable motel, I took a taxi to the glass tower downtown, where my old college friend Mark Harrison had built his legal practice over the past 3 decades. The elevator doors opened onto the 15th floor, revealing a reception area that spoke of success earned through decades of careful practice. Harrison and Associates occupied the entire floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of the Phoenix skyline and the desert mountains beyond. The receptionist, a professional woman in her 30s, looked up from her computer with the kind of polished courtesy that expensive law firms trained into their staff like muscle memory. "Mr. Thompson? Mr. Harrison is expecting you. Right this way, please." Mark's office sat at the corner of the building, with windows on 2 walls that filled the space with natural light, despite the serious nature of the business conducted there. He stood up from behind a mahogany desk that probably cost more than most people's cars, extending his hand with the same firm grip I remembered from our college days, 53 years ago. Time had silver-threaded his dark hair and added lines around his eyes, but his handshake still carried the confidence of someone accustomed to winning arguments that mattered. "John," he said, his voice carrying warmth that had been absent from most of my interactions over the past week. "It's been too long, though I wish the circumstances were better." He gestured toward a pair of leather chairs arranged around a small table near the window, away from the formal intimidation of his massive desk. The afternoon sun streaming through the glass cast everything in golden light that should have been comforting, but somehow emphasized the gravity of why I was here. I settled into the chair that faced away from the windows, not wanting the distraction of the city sprawling below us, while I explained how my carefully ordered life had been systematically dismantled by people I'd trusted completely. Mark poured coffee from a silver service that looked like it belonged in a hotel rather than an office, then sat back with the patient attention of someone trained to hear difficult stories without judgment or interruption. "Tell me everything," he said simply, pulling out a legal pad and pen with movements that suggested this wasn't his first conversation about family betrayal and financial manipulation. "Start from the beginning, and don't leave out anything that might seem irrelevant. Details matter in situations like this." I began with the empty grocery envelope and worked my way through the missing milk, the changed door codes, the unpaid utility bills, and the systematic erasure of my presence from my own home. Mark's pen moved across the yellow paper in quick, precise strokes, capturing not just the facts, but asking questions that revealed legal implications I hadn't considered. When I showed him the photographs from the Silver Moon bar, his eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained professionally neutral. "Adultery complicates things," he said, studying the images on my phone with the clinical detachment of someone who'd seen worse evidence in messier cases. "Especially when marital assets are being used to fund the relationship. These photos show clear evidence of an ongoing affair, and the expensive nature of their entertainment suggests significant financial resources are involved. I told him about Linda's lies regarding the electronic bill payments, about the past due notices arriving with my name prominently displayed, while she claimed to have set up automatic withdrawals that never existed. Mark's questions became more pointed as the scope of the financial deception became clear, and I could see him building a legal strategy even as he gathered information. "The house is in your name as trustee?" he asked, making a note that he underlined twice. "Utilities, property taxes, HOA fees, all in your name and your responsibility?" "Everything," I confirmed. "I've been paying those bills for over 40 years. I have receipts, canceled checks, bank records going back decades." Mark set down his pen and looked at me with an expression that mixed sympathy with something harder and more determined. He reached across the small table and laid a firm hand on my shoulder, the gesture both comforting and somehow final, like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict that would change everything. "John, you've been silent long enough," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Let the law speak." The words fell between us with the gravity of a gavel striking wood, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not relief exactly, but the recognition that I was no longer fighting this battle alone. "What are my options?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer from the way Mark's expression had hardened as I'd told my story. "More than you might think," he said, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of someone who'd navigated these waters many times before. "We have grounds for immediate action on several fronts: unlawful exclusion from your own property, conversion of household funds, possible forgery if she's been signing your name on anything, and marital misconduct that affects property rights. The photographs provide evidence of adultery, which in Arizona can impact property division in divorce proceedings." Divorce proceedings? The words felt strange in my mouth, like discussing surgery for someone else's family. "That's Ethan's decision to make," Mark said carefully. "But you have rights as the property owner that exist regardless of what he chooses to do about his marriage. She can't lock you out of your own home, and she certainly can't steal household funds to finance an extramarital affair." I sat in the leather chair, feeling the afternoon sun warm my shoulders, while Mark outlined a legal strategy that would restore my rights and hold Linda accountable for her actions. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had an ally who understood both the legal complexities and the emotional devastation of family betrayal. "How long will this take?" I asked. Mark's smile was sharp and professional. "That depends on how quickly they want to resolve this reasonably. Some people respond well to legal pressure. Others need to be convinced through more formal channels." Mark's invitation came as we finished reviewing the initial legal documents he'd prepared during our afternoon meeting. "Come to dinner tonight," he said, closing the thick manila folder that contained copies of property deeds, utility records, and bank statements that would form the foundation of my legal response. "Helen's been asking about you since I mentioned we were meeting, and I think you could use a reminder of what normal family dynamics look like." His house sat in the Arcadia neighborhood, a mid-century modern structure with clean lines and mature landscaping that suggested both prosperity and restraint. The front door opened before I could ring the bell, revealing Helen Harrison with the same warm smile I remembered from law school social gatherings 50 years ago. She'd aged gracefully, silver hair styled in a way that looked elegant rather than desperate, and her embrace carried genuine affection rather than the polite obligation that had characterized most of my social interactions recently. "John Thompson," she said, stepping back to look at me with the assessing gaze of someone who'd heard about my recent troubles and wanted to see how I was holding up. "You look tired, but not beaten. That's a good sign." The kitchen glowed with warm light from pendant fixtures that cast golden pools across granite countertops, where dinner preparations were clearly well underway. The air smelled like roasted chicken and herbs, real cooking that involved planning and care, rather than the takeout containers and frozen meals that had become the norm in my own home. Helen moved with efficient grace, checking the oven and adjusting seasoning while maintaining conversation, the kind of domestic competence that came from decades of making meals that people actually wanted to eat. "Dad's been telling us about your legal situation," said a voice from the kitchen island, and I turned to see Mark's son David setting the table with careful attention to proper placement of silverware and glassware. He was about Ethan's age, a successful engineer who'd inherited his father's methodical approach to problems and his mother's consideration for others. "I'm sorry you're going through this. Family conflicts are always the hardest to navigate." His wife Sarah looked up from where she was preparing a salad, her smile carrying genuine sympathy rather than the curious pity that neighbors sometimes offered when they'd heard gossip about domestic troubles. "We've set you a place at the family table," she said simply, as if having dinner guests was the most natural thing in the world, rather than an obligation they'd accepted out of politeness. I watched this family move around each other with practiced consideration, David asking his mother if she needed help with the serving dishes, Sarah automatically refilling Mark's water glass when she noticed it was empty, Helen checking with everyone about food preferences and dietary restrictions before finalizing the meal. The conversation flowed naturally between work updates, weekend plans, and gentle teasing about David's latest home improvement project that had taken 3 times longer than anticipated. "The garage door opener defeated me completely," David admitted, with the kind of good-natured self-deprecation that suggested he was secure enough to find his own limitations amusing. "I finally had to call a professional, much to Sarah's relief. I was afraid he was going to electrocute himself trying to rewire something he didn't understand," Sarah added, reaching over to pat her husband's hand affectionately. "Some battles aren't worth fighting when you can hire experts." The contrast with my own kitchen experiences over the past months hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I remembered Linda slamming pizza boxes on the table, Ethan arriving home too tired for conversation, my grandson eating in silence while the adults around him maintained the kind of tense quiet that children learned to navigate without understanding. Here, food was prepared with care, conversation included everyone at the table, and people seemed genuinely interested in each other's daily experiences. "This is how families are supposed to work," I said quietly, not meaning to speak the thought aloud, but unable to keep it inside as I watched Helen serve chicken that had been cooked with attention to everyone's preferences. Mark looked across the table with understanding that didn't require explanation. "It takes effort from everyone," he said simply. Families don't function well when one person decides the rules don't apply to them." After dinner, Mark and I sat on the back patio while the younger generation cleaned the kitchen with the kind of cooperative efficiency that suggested this was routine rather than performance for my benefit. The desert air had cooled to something almost comfortable, and the city lights sparkled beyond the pool area like earthbound stars. Mark poured bourbon from a bottle that probably cost more than I'd spent on groceries in the past month, but the expense felt like hospitality rather than showing off. "This is what you're fighting to get back," he said, handing me a glass that caught the patio lights. "Not just the house, not just your legal rights, but the possibility of family relationships based on mutual respect rather than manipulation and control." I sipped the bourbon and felt its warmth spread through my chest, mixing with something that felt like hope for the first time in weeks. "How do we start?" Mark's smile was patient and professional, the expression of someone who'd guided clients through worse situations and seen them emerge stronger. "We go back to your house tomorrow, but this time We go prepared. The night air carried the scent of citrus blossoms and chlorinated water, peaceful suburban smells that reminded me of what I was fighting to reclaim. But something told me that Linda's reaction to our legal intervention would be anything but peaceful. The familiar sound of my old door key turning in the lock felt like a small victory, even though Mark had to use a locksmith's tools to bypass the changed mechanism. 2 days of legal preparation had led to this moment, standing on my own threshold with the authority of law and friendship backing my return. Mark stepped through the doorway beside me, his presence transforming what could have been another humiliating confrontation into something that felt more like justice arriving with briefcase and business cards. The living room looked exactly as I'd left it before my exile to that miserable motel. Except now, it felt like foreign territory that I was reclaiming, rather than familiar space I'd always belonged to. Sunlight streamed through the windows I'd washed countless times, illuminating furniture I'd helped choose and pictures I'd hung during happier decades. But the atmosphere had changed completely. This was no longer a casual domestic scene, but a legal proceeding that happened to be taking place in someone's front room. Linda sat on the sectional sofa, with her legs curled beneath her, scrolling through her phone with the kind of studied indifference that suggested she'd been expecting some kind of confrontation, but hadn't anticipated it would arrive in a gray suit carrying a leather briefcase. She looked up when she heard our footsteps on the hardwood floor, her expression cycling rapidly from surprise to calculation to something that looked almost like panic, before settling on the smirking defiance I'd grown to recognize as her default response to challenge. "Well, well," she said, setting her phone aside with theatrical deliberation. "Look who decided to come crawling back." Her eyes moved from me to Mark with predatory assessment, taking in his expensive suit and professional bearing with the quick evaluation of someone accustomed to sizing up potential threats. "And who's this? Your roommate from the motel?" Mark set his briefcase on the coffee table, with the kind of deliberate precision that suggested this wasn't his first dramatic entrance into someone else's domestic crisis. The leather case made a solid thunk against the glass surface, and the brass clasps snapped open with sounds that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. "I'm Mark Harrison, attorney at law," he said, his voice filling the room with the kind of authority that came from decades of courtroom victories. "I've been John's friend for 50 years. Today, I'm his counsel." The documents emerged from the briefcase like evidence in a murder trial. Certified copies of property deeds, utility bills with my name clearly printed, tax receipts dating back years, bank records showing electronic payments that Linda claimed to have set up, but never existed. Mark spread them across the coffee table with the methodical precision of someone building an unassailable case, each piece of paper adding weight to a legal argument that was about to crush Linda's comfortable fantasy of control. "This house is legally under John M. Thompson's name as trustee," Mark continued, his finger pointing to the relevant sections of the deed, while his voice remained calm but implacable. "Utilities and taxes are his responsibility, as evidenced by these records. Locking him out is not just cruel, it's unlawful." The word unlawful hung in the air like a threat, carrying implications of legal consequences that could extend far beyond hurt feelings and family arguments. Linda's face went through another rapid transformation, color draining from her carefully made-up features as the reality of legal documentation replaced whatever story she'd been telling herself about her rights in this house. She stiffened in her seat, spine straightening with the defensive posture of someone who'd just realized they were outgunned but wasn't ready to surrender. "Honey," she called toward the kitchen, where I could hear Ethan moving around, probably making coffee with the kind of domestic routine that continued even during family crises. "Ethan, you need to hear this," she said, her voice taking on the breathless quality of someone who'd just discovered she needed backup urgently. "He's twisting everything. He just wants control." The words came out with practiced victimhood, the same tone she'd used when dismissing my grandson's need for milk, or my own requests for basic respect in my own home. Ethan appeared in the archway between kitchen and living room, coffee mug in hand, and confusion written across his features, like someone who'd walked into a movie halfway through and couldn't figure out the plot. His hair was disheveled from sleep, and he wore weekend clothes, jeans and a polo shirt that made him look younger and more vulnerable than his business attire usually allowed. When he saw the documents spread across the coffee table and Mark's professional presence dominating the room, his expression shifted from confusion to something that looked almost like dread. "Dad," he said, setting his coffee mug on the nearest side table with the careful movements of someone trying not to escalate whatever situation was unfolding in his living room. "What's going on here?" "Your father is asserting his legal rights to his own property," Mark said before I could answer, his voice carrying the kind of courtroom authority that made discussion feel more like cross-examination. "Rights that have been systematically violated through unlawful exclusion and financial manipulation." Ethan stared at the documents, picking up the property deed and reading it with the slow comprehension of someone who'd never bothered to understand the legal foundations of his own living arrangements. I watched his face as he processed the information, seeing the moment when reality began to penetrate whatever story Linda had been feeding him about ownership and authority in this household. But before understanding could fully form in his expression, Linda burst into tears with the kind of dramatic timing that suggested extensive practice in emotional manipulation. She buried her face in her hands, shoulders shaking with sobs that filled the room with the sound of feminine distress designed to short-circuit rational discussion. "He never accepted me," she choked out between theatrical gasps. "From the very beginning, he wanted me gone. Now he's using lawyers to tear this family apart." The transformation in Ethan was immediate and predictable. His face crumpled with the same expression he'd worn as a child when he'd accidentally broken something valuable, and he moved toward his weeping wife with the protective instinct of someone who'd been trained to see her tears as his personal failure. "Dad, why are you doing this?" he said, turning toward me with voice breaking under emotional pressure. "She's my wife. She's been crying for days because of you. Don't you see you're tearing this family apart?" "He just wants me gone," Linda sobbed into her hands, her words muffled but clearly audible to everyone in the room. "I've tried so hard to make this work, but nothing I do is ever good enough for him." Ethan slammed his hand against the coffee table, making the legal documents jump and scatter slightly across the glass surface. "Stop waving papers like weapons," he shouted, his voice carrying the desperate anger of someone who felt cornered by circumstances he couldn't control. "We're not a lawsuit. We're your family." I stayed silent, watching my son's face, and feeling my heart break for him, even as I recognized the necessity of what was happening. This was the boy I'd taught to ride a bicycle, the young man I'd helped through college, the son who'd once looked at me like I hung the moon and stars. Now he stood in my living room, defending someone who'd been systematically stealing from our household budget while conducting an affair that he knew nothing about. Mark placed a hand on my shoulder, the gesture both supportive and somehow final, like a chess player preparing to announce checkmate. When he spoke, his voice was slow and precise, each word weighted with the kind of legal authority that could end careers and destroy carefully constructed lies. "Family without respect is just a contract of convenience," he said, looking directly at Ethan with eyes that had seen too many similar domestic tragedies. "And even contracts break when breached." The air in the room seemed to thicken with unspoken tensions and approaching revelations. Linda clung to Ethan's shoulder with desperate fingers, her sobs continuing with the mechanical persistence of someone who'd learned to weaponize tears for maximum emotional impact. Ethan wrapped his arms around her protectively, his face showing the kind of tortured loyalty that came from years of being manipulated into believing that his wife's happiness was his personal responsibility. "If you ever loved me," Ethan said, pointing at me with trembling finger while his voice cracked under emotional strain, "stop this. Don't ruin my marriage." The words hit me like physical blows, each syllable carrying the weight of a relationship that had been systematically poisoned by someone who understood exactly how to turn son against father, using guilt and manufactured crisis. Mark turned toward me, his eyes asking the question we'd discussed during our preparation sessions. Was I ready to deploy the nuclear option? Was I prepared to destroy whatever remained of Ethan's illusions about his marriage in order to reclaim my own home and dignity? I met his gaze and nodded once, the gesture carrying all the weight of a decision that would change our family forever. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone, the device feeling heavier than usual as I slid it across the coffee table toward my son. The screen lit up automatically, displaying the photograph I'd taken outside the Silver Moon bar. Linda's face animated with genuine laughter as she wrapped her arm around a young man who looked like he'd stepped out of a fitness magazine. Their glasses were raised in intimate toast, their body language speaking of familiarity and affection that belonged to lovers rather than casual friends. Mark's voice cut through Linda's continued sobbing like a blade through silk. "This isn't John ruining your marriage," he said, his words cold as steel and twice as sharp. "It's Linda." The silence that followed was absolute and devastating. Ethan stared at the phone screen, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and something that looked like physical pain as he processed what he was seeing. Linda's sobs stopped abruptly, replaced by the kind of silence that suggested she was calculating her next move, rather than experiencing genuine emotion. That's not what it looks like," she stammered. But the words came out weak and unconvincing, even to her own ears. The photograph showed exactly what it looked like, his wife conducting an intimate relationship with another man while using family money to finance their expensive evenings out. Ethan dropped his wife's shoulder like it had burned him, stepping back from the couch and staring at her with the expression of someone who'd just realized that everything they'd believed about their life was built on lies. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with the kind of grief that came from discovering betrayal rather than loss. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Linda's muffled sobs, which now sounded more like panic than sorrow. Mark closed his briefcase with deliberate finality, the brass clasps snapping shut with sounds that seemed to echo in the emotionally charged silence. He gathered the scattered legal documents from the coffee table, organizing them into a neat stack that represented not just property rights, but the restoration of natural order in a household that had been turned upside down by manipulation and deceit. "John has been silent long enough," he said, his voice carrying the weight of final judgment as he looked from Ethan to Linda and back again. "The law is on his side. The truth is on the table. From here on, the choice is yours, Ethan." I walked to the kitchen and retrieved my moss-green ceramic mug from the cabinet where it had been relegated during my exile. The familiar weight of it in my hands felt like reclaiming a piece of my identity that had been temporarily misplaced. I set it on the coffee table beside the legal documents, then pulled up one of the dining room chairs and sat down in my own living room for the first time in over a week. No words were needed. The gesture spoke louder than any speech about ownership, belonging, and the restoration of proper hierarchy in a household that had been operating under false premises. Linda gasped audibly, her face going pale as paper, as she realized the implications of my casual reclamation of domestic space. Ethan remained motionless, his head bowed under the weight of revelations that had shattered his understanding of his own marriage. Light spilled through the windows I'd washed and maintained for decades, illuminating the table where truth had finally been served alongside legal documents that couldn't be dismissed or manipulated. The house no longer belonged to lies, and everyone in the room knew that the rules of engagement had changed permanently. Saturday evening found me back in my kitchen for the first time in over a week, standing over the gas stove where blue flames licked the bottom of my grandmother's old pot. The familiar ticking of the oven and the scent of garlic and oregano filled the air with something that felt more like home than any legal document could provide. I'd spent the afternoon simmering meatballs in tomato sauce, the kind of meal that required patience and attention rather than the takeout containers and frozen dinners that had defined too many recent family gatherings. My grandson sat across from me at the kitchen table, fiddling with his fork while steam rose from his plate like incense from a dinner altar. "Grandpa, this tastes way better than pizza," he said, his young voice carrying the kind of honest appreciation that made all the legal battles and emotional confrontations feel worthwhile. His smile was uncomplicated by adult politics and manipulative tears, a reminder that some relationships in this house were still based on genuine affection rather than calculated convenience. The kitchen door opened, and Ethan appeared in the doorway like a ghost haunting his former life. His shirt was untucked. His eyes carried the red-rimmed evidence of too many difficult conversations, and his posture suggested someone who'd spent days making decisions he'd never wanted to face. He looked at the meal I'd prepared, at his son eating with obvious pleasure, then at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. He didn't step into the kitchen, didn't pull up a chair, or ask if there was enough food for one more person. Instead, he stood in the doorway like someone visiting a museum of his former happiness, observing but not participating in the domestic scene that had once included him as a central figure. The silence stretched between us, filled with all the things neither of us was ready to say about betrayal, forgiveness, and the price of loyalty misplaced. "Dad," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd spent days trying to figure out how to apologize for things that couldn't be undone. "I'm sorry. I should have known what she was doing." Mark looked up from his Diet Coke, tilting his head with the kind of gentle observation that came from decades of watching families navigate their worst moments. "This house feels alive again," he said simply, the words carrying more warmth than any legal victory could provide. I placed the moss-green ceramic mug on the table beside my plate, my fingers brushing the familiar chip near the handle without gripping it like a lifeline this time. The mug simply rested there, as ordinary and permanent as the worn wooden table, the fluorescent light glowing overhead, and the scene that probably looked identical to millions of American kitchens on similar Saturday evenings. But for me, this represented something more significant than dinner. This was a new order built on truth rather than manipulation, respect rather than control, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that no one could cast me out from my own porch again. The house no longer belonged to lies, and everyone who remained understood that some battles, once fought and won, changed everything that came after.